The air over Tel Aviv and Tehran shares a single, terrifying characteristic today. It is no longer empty. In Tel Aviv, the mechanical wail of the early warning system has become the background noise of daily life. In Tehran, the silence of the night is broken not by sirens, but by the low, predatory hum of MQ-9 Reapers loitering at 30,000 feet. We are now 5 days into Operation Epic Fury, and the initial assumption that a decapitation strike would bring an immediate end to the Islamic Republic has proven to be a strategic miscalculation. The world is realizing that while you can kill a leader, you cannot so easily kill a system designed for survival through redundancy. This conflict began with a promise of surgical precision and a rapid return to the negotiating table. On Saturday morning, the joint United States and Israeli air campaign achieved what many thought was impossible. They successfully liquidated the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, along with 40 of the regime's most senior military and security officials in a single coordinated strike package. It was meant to be the silver bullet. Instead, it has triggered a regional contagion that is now drawing every major player into the fire. The decapitation was successful, but the body of the Iranian state is still very much alive and lashing out with a desperate, autonomous fury. For those watching from the safety of the West, the images of intercepted missiles over the Mediterranean suggest a controlled victory, but the ground reality in the Gulf tells a different story. The forecast of a 3-day war has vanished. What remains is a deepening crisis where the off-ramp is obstructed by the smoke of burning industrial hubs. The Iranian regime has not imploded. The revolution that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu called for has not materialized. Instead of a popular uprising, we are seeing the activation of a security state that has spent 4 decades preparing for this exact moment of existential threat. The failure of the initial shock and awe campaign to produce a surrender is rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of the Iranian command structure. Most Western analysts treated the regime like a traditional dictatorship where power is concentrated in a single point. If that point is removed, the army dissipates. But the Islamic Republic is an organism with a decentralized nervous system. By Sunday, less than 24 hours after the death of the supreme leader, an interim leadership council was already functioning. They did not wait for the dust to settle. They authorized a series of retaliatory strikes that have now effectively shut down the world's most critical energy artery. As we move into the 4th day of active kinetic operations, the military objective has shifted. Allied forces have established what the Joint Chiefs call local air superiority. This means that American and Israeli jets are no longer just suppressing air defenses. They are loitering over major cities, conducting battle damage assessments in real time, and striking targets as they emerge. But this dominance in the air has not translated to control on the ground. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has moved its command centers into the deep mountains and urban tunnels, leaving the Allies to punch at shadows while the cost of the war begins to manifest in the global markets. The humanitarian toll is also rising, complicating the narrative of a war for liberation. The Iranian Red Crescent reports nearly 800 dead, many of them civilians caught in the crossfire, as the Allies target the deeply integrated security infrastructure. Each strike that hits a non-military site, like the reported destruction of the state broadcaster headquarters or the damage to historic districts, acts as a recruitment tool for the very regime the Allies are trying to topple. It creates a nationalist rally around the flag effect that makes the prospect of a pro-Western revolution look increasingly remote. The strategic reality of March 3, 2026, is that we are in a stalemate of escalation. The Allies possess the technology and the firepower to degrade Iran's infrastructure indefinitely. However, the Iranian leadership has shown they possess the will to burn the neighborhood down before they accept a dictated peace. They are using their remaining missile and drone inventory to strike not just at military bases, but at the economic heart of the U.S. alliance system in the Middle East. The sirens in Tel Aviv are no longer just a warning of incoming fire. They are the sound of a regional order that is being permanently dismantled, one interception at a time. Gemini said, "The survival of the Iranian state in the face of such a devastating loss is not an accident of history. It is the result of a deliberate, multi-layered architecture of power. To understand why the country did not fall into immediate chaos, one must look at the specific mechanics of the Interim Leadership Council. This 4-man quadrumvirate, comprised of the Chief Justice, the Speaker of the Parliament, and key religious and administrative figures, was operational within hours of the strike on the Supreme Leader's compound. They did not need to debate their roles. The protocols for succession are written into the very fabric of the theocracy, and they are designed to bridge the gap between a single absolute ruler and a collective survival committee. The competitor's analysis of the regime as an organism is accurate, but it misses the cold logistical reality of how that organism functions under fire. The Islamic Republic does not operate like a traditional military hierarchy where a break in the chain of command leads to paralysis. Instead, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps operates on a doctrine of decentralized command. Local commanders in provinces like Khuzestan or Sistan and Baluchistan have pre-authorized standing orders. If the central government in Tehran goes dark, these commanders are empowered to execute retaliation strikes on their own initiative. This is why we are seeing missiles being fired from mobile launchers in remote desert regions, even while the capital is under a total aerial blockade. The presence of this interim council has effectively neutralized the Allied hope for a quick regime collapse. While the West waits for a moderate faction to emerge and sue for peace, the hardliners on the council have doubled down on their survivalist doctrine. They are not interested in an off-ramp that involves the dismantling of their security apparatus. To them, the assassination of the supreme leader was not just a military act. It was a declaration of total war that justifies any level of response. This includes the activation of internal security units like the Basij, which have now turned Iranian cities into a grid of checkpoints, making it impossible for the stirrings of revolution to gain any physical momentum. Behind the scenes, the struggle for a singular successor is already beginning, but it is being conducted with a discipline that surprises Western intelligence. Reportedly, Ali Larijani is emerging as a coordinating figure, acting as the liaison between the clerical establishment and the military elite. His role is to ensure that the transition does not lead to a civil war within the ranks. This internal stability is the regime's most potent weapon against the Allied strategy of regime change. As long as the security forces remain loyal to the concept of the state rather than a single individual, the Allied air campaign remains a war against a ghost that refuses to stay dead. The irony of the current Allied strategy is that by focusing so heavily on high-profile assassinations, they may have inadvertently unified the fragmented Iranian political class. In the weeks before the war, the regime was facing significant internal dissent over economic mismanagement. However, the sight of foreign jets over Tehran has shifted the public conversation from domestic grievances to national survival. Even those who hated the supreme leader find it difficult to side with a coalition that is systematically destroying their country's power grid and communication hubs. The regime is using this nationalist surge to justify even harsher internal repression, framing any dissent as treason in a time of war. Furthermore, the clerical elite has successfully maintained the narrative that they are the only force standing between Iran and the type of state collapse seen in Syria or Iraq. They point to the precision strikes that have inevitably caused collateral damage as evidence of the West's disregard for Iranian life. This propaganda is reinforced by the total shutdown of the internet, which leaves the population with only the state-run narrative. By controlling the information environment, the Interim Council has managed to keep the 93 million-strong population in a state of suspended animation, too fearful of the bombs to rise up and too isolated to coordinate an alternative future. The strategic deadlock is now clear. The Allies are waiting for a revolution that cannot start, and the Iranian leadership is waiting for an economic crisis in the West that they hope to trigger through asymmetric means. This is not a war of territory, it is a war of will and organizational resilience. The Iranian state has proven it is more than just a one-man dictatorship. It is a deeply embedded system of governance and security that has spent decades building the very walls that the Allies are now trying to tear down. As the bombing continues into its second week, the question is no longer about who leads Iran, but about whether there will be anything left to lead by the time the smoke clears. While the air war rages over the plateau of Iran, a second and perhaps more consequential front has opened in the turquoise waters of the Persian Gulf. On March 2, 2026, the strategic calculation of the war changed fundamentally when a swarm of low-flying suicide drones successfully penetrated the sophisticated air defenses of Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city. This facility is the heart of the world's liquefied natural gas supply, and the impact of the strike was felt instantly in the trading pits of London and New York. By targeting the infrastructure of a neutral third party that hosts a major American airbase, the Iranian leadership has executed a move of cold, calculated desperation. They have stopped trying to win the war on the battlefield and have instead begun holding the global energy market for ransom. The logic behind the strike on Ras Laffan is a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. The Iranian Interim Council knows that they cannot stop the Allied sorties that are systematically degrading their own oil refineries. However, they also know that the global economy is a fragile ecosystem. By knocking out nearly 20% of the world's LNG export capacity in a single afternoon, they have forced the conflict into the homes of every voter in the West. In Europe, natural gas prices surged by 50% within 6 hours of the attack. In the United States, the average price of gasoline has begun a steady climb toward $5 a gallon, creating a political nightmare for the Trump administration as it prepares for the upcoming midterm elections. This is what analysts call the economic denial strategy. Iran is essentially telling the world that if their energy infrastructure is going to be reduced to rubble, they will ensure that no one else in the region gets to profit from theirs either. The strike on Qatar was not an act of madness, but a message to the other Gulf monarchies. It serves as a grim warning to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates that their neutrality is an illusion as long as they provide the logistical backbone for the Allied campaign. The message is clear. If American jets fly from your soil, your skyscrapers and your gas terminals are legitimate targets in the eyes of a dying regime. The most effective weapon in Iran's current arsenal is not a missile or a drone, but the concept of war risk. In the last 48 hours, the global insurance market has effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. Even though the United States Navy has declared the shipping lanes open and safe, no commercial tanker captain is willing to risk a multi-billion-dollar vessel in waters where autonomous underwater mines and shore-based anti-ship missiles are a constant threat. Insurance premiums for transit through the Gulf have hit levels not seen since the height of the Second World War. For all practical purposes, the energy artery of the world has been severed, and the resulting blockade is being enforced by the fear of what might happen rather than the presence of a physical fleet. This economic pressure is designed to create an intolerable level of pain for the Allied coalition. The Iranian leadership is banking on the idea that the Western public's appetite for regime change will vanish the moment the war begins to threaten their standard of living. They are betting that the political cost of a prolonged energy crisis will force Washington to the negotiating table before the Iranian security state actually collapses. It is a race against time. The Allies are trying to break the regime's will through aerial bombardment, while the regime is trying to break the West's will through global inflation and energy scarcity. The strike on Ras Laffan has also exposed the limitations of the Allied missile defense umbrella. Despite billions of dollars in investment, the sheer volume of a coordinated drone and missile swarm can still find gaps in the most advanced systems. This realization has sent a shockwave through the corporate boardrooms of the Gulf. If the world's most protected gas facility can be hit, then no piece of infrastructure in the Middle East is truly safe. This creates a secondary economic effect as foreign investors begin a frantic pullout from the region, fearing that the war will turn the glittering cities of Dubai and Doha into a new front line of a scorched earth campaign. As we analyze the fallout of the last 2 days, the strategic picture is one of extreme volatility. The Allies are now faced with a choice that they hope to avoid. They can either escalate their strikes to include a total naval blockade of Iran, risking a direct confrontation with the remaining elements of the Iranian Navy, or they can continue the air war while watching the global economy bleed out. The Iranian Interim Council has successfully turned their own destruction into a global liability. They are no longer just fighting for their own survival. They are fighting to ensure that their downfall comes at a price the rest of the world is not willing to pay. The regional fallout from the strikes on Tehran has moved beyond the borders of Iran and into the streets of the surrounding nations, creating a phenomenon that military planners call proxy integration. For decades, the West viewed Iran's network of allied militias as a secondary threat, a collection of local actors that could be managed or ignored. But in the last 48 hours, this network has shifted from a state of managed tension to one of total mobilization. In Iraq, the situation has become particularly precarious. Reports from Baghdad indicate that tens of thousands of young men have taken to the streets, not to protest their own government, but to demand a fatwa of war against the Allied coalition. This is not just spontaneous anger. It is the activation of pre-positioned command and control links that have been meticulously built over 40 years. In the neighboring regions of Pakistan and Bahrain, the situation is equally volatile. Yesterday, the United States consulate in Pakistan was reportedly overrun by a mob of protesters following news of the killing of the supreme leader. This incident serves as a stark reminder that the conflict is no longer a localized air campaign. It is becoming a cultural and religious flashpoint that spans the Islamic world. The competitor's script touched on this briefly, but it missed the strategic significance of the Iranian doctrine. These proxies do not need a centralized command in Tehran to function. They have been trained to operate autonomously in the event of a leadership collapse, turning the entire Middle East into a patchwork of potential front lines where American assets are now under constant threat. The catalyst for this regional surge is not just the death of the supreme leader, but a series of tactical errors by the Allied forces that have played directly into the regime's propaganda. On March 2nd, a reported strike on a suspected drone facility in Minab resulted in heavy civilian casualties, including the destruction of a nearby school. For the Allied planners, this was a tragic failure of intelligence or a mechanical malfunction. For the people of the region, however, it was a defining image of the war. This Minab incident has been used by pro-Iranian media to frame the conflict not as a war of liberation, but as a systematic campaign of Western aggression against the Iranian people. It has effectively neutralized any potential for a popular uprising by uniting the public in a shared sense of grievance and national defense. This nationalist rally is also being felt in Lebanon, where Hezbollah has launched its most significant missile barrages against northern Israel since the conflict began. The goal is not necessarily to win a ground war, but to force the Israeli military to divert its air defense resources away from the Iranian theater. This is the strategy of multi-front attrition. By triggering these proxy dominoes, the Iranian interim leadership is trying to stretch the Allied military and political resources to their breaking point. They are counting on the fact that while the United States and Israel have superior technology, they have a much lower threshold for a prolonged, messy, and unpopular conflict that involves significant casualties on multiple fronts. Furthermore, the involvement of non-state actors has complicated the geopolitical stance of major powers like Russia and China. While Moscow has officially condemned the Allied strikes as a violation of international law, they have refrained from any direct military intervention. Instead, the Kremlin is content to watch as the United States becomes bogged down in yet another Middle Eastern quagmire. Every day that the war continues, the price of oil remains at record highs, padding Russia's war chest for its own interests in Eastern Europe. For China, the calculation is even more pragmatic. Beijing is currently the only player with enough economic leverage over Tehran to force a de-escalation, but they are using that leverage to secure their own energy interests rather than to support the Allied objective of regime change. The result is a geopolitical deadlock where the Allied coalition is increasingly isolated. The coalition of the willing that was promised at the start of the operation has failed to materialize beyond a small core of primary actors. Many European allies are quietly distancing themselves from the Trump administration's maximum pressure 2.0, fearing the economic and social consequences of a regional war that shows no sign of ending. The Iranian leadership is exploiting this lack of unity, using their proxy network to target the interests of any nation that offers even tacit support to the bombing campaign. We are now entering the most dangerous phase of the conflict. The Allied forces are faced with a choice. They can either expand the war to target the proxy bases in Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen, which would essentially trigger a total regional war, or they can continue to strike at the heart of Iran while their own regional allies face a relentless wave of asymmetric attacks. The Iranian strategy of proxy integration has successfully transformed a surgical strike into a regional contagion. They have shown that while they may be outgunned in the skies over Tehran, they still possess the ability to strike back through 1,000 cuts across the entire Middle East. The debate over the future of Iran often centers on the figure of Reza Pahlavi, the son of the last Shah, who has been framed by some in the West as a potential leader for a new secular era. However, The reality on the ground in March 2026 suggests a profound disconnect between the narrative in Washington and the sentiment in the streets of Tehran. While Pahlavi acts as a spokesperson for transition, he is increasingly viewed through the lens of the Pahlavi paradox. He calls for a revolution from the comfort of foreign television studios, urging young Iranians to face the bullets of the security state. This has created a growing sense of resentment among the very people he hopes to lead. They want change, but they are weary of leaders who remain insulated from the physical consequences of the war they support. The competitor's script correctly identified the hesitation of the Iranian public, but it failed to analyze the logistical barriers to any potential uprising. The reason the streets have not erupted in a pro-Western revolution is not just fear, it is the physical grid of the security state. Since the start of Operation Epic Fury, the Iranian Law Enforcement Command and the Basij have established a total internal blockade. Every major city block is a series of checkpoints. Communication is nearly non-existent. In this environment, a revolution is not just a matter of will, it is a matter of coordination, and that coordination has been systematically severed. The regime has learned from the protests of 2022 and early 2026, ensuring that any spark of dissent is extinguished before it can turn into a flame. There is also the historical memory of foreign intervention that the Allies seem to have underestimated. Iranians have a long and complicated history with external powers. From the British and Russians of the 19th century to the C1A-backed coup of 1953. This deep-seated instinct to be allergic to foreign-imposed change is currently working in the regime's favor. Even those who have suffered under the theocracy for decades are hesitant to welcome a future that is delivered on the back of American cruise missiles. They look at the Syrianization of the region and fear that a vacuum of power will lead not to democracy, but to a decade of sectarian civil war and national fragmentation. The political prisoners who were supposed to be the vanguard of a new Iran remain locked in the Evin and Raji Shahir prisons, their fates ignored by the high-level strategic briefings. In a telling sign of the regime's cold-blooded focus, one of the first targets of the internal security crackdown was the compound of Mir Hossein Mousavi, the leader of the Green Movement, who has been under house arrest for years. This strike was a clear message to the population. There will be no moderate alternative, and there will be no release for those who could offer a competing vision of the state. The choice the regime offers the people is simple: total submission to the current order or the total decimation of the country. This leads to a fundamental question about the Allied end goal. If the objective is a strong secular democracy, as some in the Trump administration suggest, then the current strategy of destroying national heritage sites and critical infrastructure is counterproductive. It is impossible to build a stable democracy on the ruins of a collapsed society. Instead, the strategy appears to be moving toward the creation of a weakened, fragmented state. This is what some cynical observers in the region call the Syria model. By degrading Iran's military and economic power to the point of irrecoverability, the Allies may be seeking a neighbor that is too broken to ever again threaten the regional order, regardless of who is in charge. The Pahlavi narrative also ignores the complexity of the Iranian identity, which is tied to a history of imperial pride that predates the Islamic Republic by millennia. The regime has successfully co-opted this nationalism, framing the defense of the theocracy as the defense of the Persian heartland itself. When the Golestan Palace, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was damaged by shockwaves from a nearby strike on a command center, the regime turned it into a national tragedy. They are not just fighting for their religion, they are fighting for the soil. This fusion of faith and nationalism creates a resilient social fabric that is much harder to tear than a simple political dictatorship. As we look toward the next phase of the crisis, the disconnect remains the defining feature of the war. The Allies are waiting for a democratic off-ramp that has no physical road leading to it. The Iranian people are caught between a regime that uses them as human shields and a coalition that sees them as a secondary variable in a grand strategic game. The dream of a secular, peaceful Iran remains as distant as ever, buried under the weight of a war that is destroying the very infrastructure required for a modern state to function. The revolution is not coming. Instead, the country is simply hunkering down, waiting to see what survives the fire. The geopolitical drama of 2026 is being scripted not just in the war rooms of Tehran and Tel Aviv, but in the polling stations of the West. For Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump, the military campaign against Iran is inseparable from their own political survival. We are witnessing a collision of national security and local ambition where the definition of victory is being reshaped to fit the needs of upcoming elections. In Israel, the parliamentary elections are only months away, and for Netanyahu, a decisive blow against the Iranian threat is the only narrative that can overshadow the domestic controversies that have plagued his long tenure. He is betting that the Israeli public's trauma will translate into a demand for a total victory, regardless of the long-term regional cost. The contrast between the American and Israeli off-ramps is becoming a source of quiet friction within the coalition. Donald Trump is facing his own verdict in the midterms, and his primary concern is the price at the pump. The American voter traditionally judges an administration by the cost of living, not the success of a distant air war. Trump wants a conflict that is quick, decisive, and most importantly, over before the global energy shock becomes an electoral liability. He is attempting to brand this as a business-style war, different from the protracted entanglements of the Bush and Obama eras. He wants a deal he can sell as a win, even if it leaves the Iranian security apparatus largely intact under a new, more compliant figurehead. This cynical reality was captured in the recent shrug of Yair Lapid when asked if the war helps Netanyahu's re-election. His response, "We are all Israelis now," illustrates the political paralysis that war often creates. In the early days of a conflict, opposition leaders rarely find profit in criticizing a military strategy, even if they suspect it is flawed. However, this unity is a fragile veneer. If the war drags into a second month and the promised collapse of the regime does not materialize, this all-Israelis sentiment will evaporate, replaced by a fierce debate over the human and economic toll of a war without an exit strategy. For Netanyahu, the ideal outcome is the permanent degradation of Iran's nuclear and missile capability, ensuring it can never again act as a regional bogeyman. For Trump, the goal is more transactional, a change in leadership that allows for the resumption of global energy flows and the stabilization of the markets. These are not necessarily the same thing. A weakened but still defiant Iran serves Netanyahu's political narrative of constant vigilance, while it acts as a permanent drain on the American economy that Trump cannot afford. This divergence in goals suggests that the same script they are currently reading from has two very different final acts. The allies are also contending with the psychological toll on their own populations. In Israel, every night disrupted by sirens and interceptions harms the image of a government that promised absolute security. Even a successful defense begins to feel like a failure if the threat never stops. On the other side of the Atlantic, the American public is watching the return of forever war headlines with growing skepticism. The promise of a clean, aerial-only campaign is being tested by the reality of a regional energy ransom that affects every household. The political capital of both leaders is being burned as fast as the jet fuel over the Persian Gulf. The paradox of the current situation is that both leaders are now trapped by the very escalations they initiated. Netanyahu cannot stop without a total victory that may be militarily impossible, and Trump cannot continue if the economic cost threatens his domestic agenda. They are both looking for a victory they can frame as decisive, yet they are fighting an adversary that specializes in staying alive in the wreckage. The election calendar is the invisible hand guiding the frequency of the strikes, creating a dangerous tempo where military logic is secondary to the news cycle. As we move toward the middle of March, the question is which will break first: the Iranian regime's ability to survive the bombs, or the Western leaders' political ability to sustain the cost of the war. The off-ramp is no longer a strategic choice made in a vacuum. It is a desperate search for a conclusion that allows both Trump and Netanyahu to declare victory before their voters tell them otherwise. The war has become a high-stakes campaign ad, and the final bill is being paid in blood and global economic stability. The final chapter of this conflict is being written not in the language of diplomacy, but in the heritage of ash. For the people of Iran, the last 72 hours have brought a devastating realization. The war has moved beyond the targeting of the Revolutionary Guard and into the systematic destruction of their history. The reported damage to the Golestan Palace, a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a symbol of Persian identity, marks a psychological threshold in the war. For the Allied planners, it was likely an unintended consequence of a strike on a nearby underground command bunker. For the Iranian public, it is a sign that the very soul of their nation is being dismantled. This is the stage where the strategic goal of regime change begins to look indistinguishable from the total decimation of a country. The silence in the halls of power in Washington and Tel Aviv regarding the cultural toll of the war is chilling. It reinforces the suspicion that the Allied endgame is not the creation of a stable, democratic neighbor, but the permanent degradation of a regional rival. This is the dark reality of the Syria model being applied to a nation of 93 million people. By turning the infrastructure of a modern state, its power grids, its communication hubs, and its historical landmarks, into rubble, the Allies are ensuring that whoever leads Iran next will inherit a hollowed-out shell. It is a strategy of permanent denial, ensuring that the country remains on its knees for a generation, regardless of its political leanings. As the fires continue to burn in the industrial zones and the sirens remain the soundtrack of the Levant, the off-ramp remains a mirage. The Iranian leadership, now a collective hydra of survivors, has shown that it can endure the loss of its head. They are hunkering down in the deep mountains, content to let the world bleed through high energy prices while they wait for the Western political will to crumble. The Iranian public, caught between the hammer of the Allied Air Force and the anvil of the internal security state, is simply trying to survive the night. They are mourning their dead and watching their heritage burn, while the world watches the geopolitical drama play out on high-definition screens. The strategic forecast for the weeks ahead is one of relentless attrition. The hope for a quick, decisive conclusion has been replaced by the grit of a prolonged regional war. The global economy is recalibrating to a world where the Strait of Hormuz is a ghost lane and energy security is a memory of the past. For Discourse on World Affairs, the analysis is cold but clear. We are witnessing the end of a regional order that has stood for nearly half a century. What emerges from the smoke will not be the secular democracy the West dreamed of, but a fragmented, traumatized region that will bear the scars of this march for decades to come. In the end, the war over Iran is proving that technology and firepower can destroy a regime's capacity to govern, but they cannot so easily replace it with something better. The forecast of a few days ago was a debate about possibilities. Today, we are documenting a reality of permanent loss. The sirens in Tel Aviv and the hum of the reapers over Tehran are the only voices that matter now. They are telling us that in the game of regional dominance, victory is often just another name for being the last one standing in the ruins. As the sun sets on the fifth day of Operation Epic Fury, the only certainty is that the Middle East we knew is gone, and the one taking its place is being forged in the heat of a fire that no one seems to know how to extinguish.